I'm a really irregular pincher. And that kind of goes to my theory in a cutting garden that everything should be easy, everything should be enjoyable, and you really shouldn't stress. If your aim for a cut flower garden is to bring you joy, but then it's causing you stress and angst, instead, you're doing it wrong. But that said, I don't take a measuring stick out there and measure these plants before I pinch them off. But for plants that I am going to pinch, I usually like to see at least two pairs of true leaves. So that's, you have the seed leaf that comes out and just looks like this fat little baby leaf, and then the true leaves that look like the actual leaf of the plant. And so I want to make sure that there's at least three pairs of true leaves. And that plant is a little well established, because what we're going to go in and do is pinch off that growing tip and some of the plant. So I want it to be established and looking healthy before I do that.
Welcome to the Mother Earth News and Friends podcast. At Mother Earth News, for 50 years and counting, we've been dedicated to conserving the planet's natural resources while helping you conserve your financial resources. In this podcast, we host conversations with experts in the fields of sustainability, homesteading, natural health, and more to share all about how you can live well wherever you are in a way that values both people and our Mother Earth.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Mother Earth News and Friends. I'm Josh Wilder, and with me today I have Andy Wilcox. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, thanks, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so I'm Andy Wilcox. I'm a garden writer, horticulture writer, educator, speaker, sometime flower farmer. And I've been passionate about gardening and soil and the whole process of how that changes people for years. I'm a master gardener up here in the frozen north, eagerly awaiting spring. And today we're going to talk about some perfect plants for a cut flower garden. A lot of folks struggle with exactly how to get that cut flower garden going or what they should plant, and chat about it a little bit today.
I appreciate that description of your garden. I can only imagine it's quite beautiful to spend time in the spring.
It's very nice in spring, summer, and fall, but right now it just looks like a winter wonderland.
Yeah, that kind of transitions to my first question. In your experience, what's the most challenging gap month for a garden, and what plant varieties do you rely on most to try to bridge that transition for perennials?
So the trouble for me is always early summer. None of the annuals are blooming yet, and this is when some of the perennials that we talked about can really step in, as well as any of those plants that we grow from bulbs, those spring daffodils or tulips. Peonies, tulips, bushes like pussy willows and forsythia and serviceberry are all great choices. And the nice part about some of those blooming bushes is they don't have to be right in the garden proper. They can be located on the edge of your yard or up against the foundation or wherever you can squeak a little space in. And they make a great addition to help flesh out whatever else you've got in bloom. But yeah, nobody expects a flower in April, but come May, we expect flowers, and it can be hard to have anything going on in May and June, especially if you're focusing on the annuals.
For sure. And as far as pinching, are there specific heights or leaf node counts you look for before doing some of that in different varieties?
So I'm a really irregular pincher. And that kind of goes to my theory in a cutting garden that everything should be easy, everything should be enjoyable, and you really shouldn't stress. If your aim for a cut flower garden is to bring you joy, but then it's causing you stress and angst, instead, you're doing it wrong. But that said, I don't take a measuring stick out there and measure these plants before I pinch them off. But for plants that I am going to pinch, I usually like to see at least two pairs of true leaves. So that's, you have the seed leaf that comes out and just looks like this fat little baby leaf, and then the true leaves that look like the actual leaf of the plant. And so I want to make sure that there's at least three pairs of true leaves. And that plant is a little well established, because what we're going to go in and do is pinch off that growing tip and some of the plant. So I want it to be established and looking healthy before I do it. I think I mentioned for the dahlias, when they're about 6 to 8 inches tall is usually a good time to do that. And when they're as tall as your hand is long, that's usually a pretty good time to start pinching any of those flowers that you pinch. I did want to mention, we talked about branching sunflowers as a choice to grow in the cut flower garden. And those are fine to pinch when they get a little bit bigger, but don't pinch any regular sunflowers. Any flower that's going to make just one bloom, like a standard sunflower, if you pinch it, you just might not get that bloom. When we pinch, we're trying to make a bushier plant with more stems that are going to make more blooms. And so for a plant like a standard sunflower that only makes the one, that's just something that we don't pinch. But otherwise, just about every annual in there that we talked about benefits from pinching.
Now, you're up in Wisconsin, right? And probably stone's throw from a lake or three. So your summers are probably fairly humid, if my memory serves me correctly.
Yep.
So beyond spacing and getting some air circulation there, Do you use any foliar sprays or soil health practices to manage mildew?
So I've tried a few foliar sprays. I've tried the baking soda and the milk, which I always thought was weird that I'd go out and spray milk in my garden. And I've tried a couple of other products. I've never really been impressed with the results, but that's probably because I wait too long and I don't do it regularly enough. Using a foliar spray for powdery mildew is really, you need to start as a preventative and then keep at it regularly every week or two. You've got to keep up with it. And I'm just not organized when it comes to my cut flower garden to get that done. And that said, in the flower garden, I don't have a terrible problem with powdery mildew. I get some on my zinnias, but it's usually not enough to really impact the blooms. The Monarda, that bee balm, will typically pick up some powdery mildew by the late summer, but by that time it's done blooming and it's been growing for a month and it's already put a lot of energy into the root system, so it doesn't seem to slow it down a lot for me. Other locations, some folks do have more problems with powdery mildew. But yeah, I like to rely on keeping a healthy, vigorous plant and then that air circulation and making sure that I don't have everything just super crowded. And for folks who are having trouble with powdery mildew, watering from below can also help. If it rains from above, why not water from above? But you're just reducing the time that those leaves are wet. So if it rains once a week, but you're watering 4 times a week, you can really reduce how long those leaves are wet. Water.
And going on other additives and supplies in the garden, do you support using any flower food, sugar, vinegar, that sort of thing to make a difference for some of the flowers you recommended?
Sure, you're talking like in the vase once they're harvested?
Yeah.
Yeah. For home enjoyment, cut flower garden at home, fresh water is all I use. And the flowers I recommended in the article, they do very well with that. I think one of the keys to remember is that the flowers you go out and cut from the garden are days or even a week fresher than what you might get at that florist shop. And so you've got that advantage going for you right off the bat. You went out and you cut them in the morning and they plopped them into a vase and you've got them going from day one where they're fresh and they're still taking up water. They're still doing their cycle. For me, it comes down again to being simple and enjoyable. And if I've got to dip flower ends in boiling water and then put in some vinegar and then a little sugar solution, I'm not having fun anymore. Now it's turned into a chore. I just want some bouquets in the kitchen to enjoy or to give away to a neighbor or whatever. So if your cut flower garden is producing blooms, then you're always going to be able to go out and get a fresh bouquet. So if your flowers are only lasting a week, which a week is pretty average for cut flowers fresh from the garden, then you're already doing better than you get them from the florist, and you can go out in a week and get more. So I typically don't bother with any of those additives.
Sure. Yeah, and that's, I think, my experience talking to folks who are interested in growing a cut flower garden, then just generally stems from getting some flowers at the farmer's market, for instance, and the difference that they've seen in that from the florist, and really just the variety of bouquets, because you're not going to get some of the having oregano in the bouquet, for example, and many florists.
Yeah. And farmer's market is another great source for cut flowers. I've sold a farmer's market before, and most of those flower farmers are cutting them either the night before or the morning of. Get up at 4 a.m. and they're out there snipping blooms. I was always out doing it the night before until dark and then trying to arrange them. So you're still getting them very fresh.
Sure. Now, as far as if you're trying to store some of the flowers, a professional seller, are there any DIY storage mediums like vermiculite, etc., to keep them hydrated without rotting over the winter?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And people often have trouble, especially with dahlia tubers. They have trouble storing those over the winter. I should admit this. I really often don't do anything. Just because I'm pretty lucky with my basement. I have one side of it that stays pretty humid. And it's good enough that most of my dahlias sit in a milk crate over the winter. And they might get a little bit wrinkly, but they're still looking all right and still easy to divide. And when I plant them in the spring, they pop up. But that said, a lot of people have trouble storing those tubers. And I used to have trouble storing them. And some varieties don't store as well as others. And so when I do need to do some storage for them that's a little bit more involved, I separate them by variety, which is for my own sanity. It's not for storage. It's just so I remember what's where in the spring. And then I get cheap plastic tubs. They're usually clear-sided just so I can see what's going on inside. They don't have to be. That's just my preference. And they're kind of shallow. So you're talking maybe those tubs that you would get from the big box store that are 14 inches long and 10 inches wide, but they're only maybe 6 inches deep. And then pine shavings that you get, I think people buy them for pet rabbits or something.
Crickens a lot of times too.
That's so pine shavings that you might get at the feed supply store or any of that sort of material. And I'll put a layer in the bottom and then I'll stack the dahlia tubers one deep. Sometimes I'll put another layer of pine shavings and then another layer of tubers. And then I leave the lid just slightly ajar. So I don't seal it down. I'll leave that so that there can be the slightest exchange of air back and forth. And then you got to go down and peek at them. You've had trouble before with them either being too dry or too humid. You're going to have to go down and check on it and see how they're doing. And so then you've got a system set up where if they're getting a little dry, you can mist them and shut the lid for a few days. You're down there and there's condensation all over the plastic. That's why I like the clear plastic. You can pop the lid off for a couple days and adjust that humidity. When a dahlia tuber is storing well, it'll look kind of similar to a potato in that it's still firm, that skin is still tight. By late spring, they'll start to get a little wrinkly and wizened looking, and that's okay, but they shouldn't look like shriveled up parsnip. They should still have some moisture in. But you can also use vermiculite if you can get it at a reasonable price, works very well. A hint for the audience, you buy vermiculite at the garden center, expensive. But if you ask around at perhaps the nursery or a feed store, sometimes they've got it. I just bought, I think it was a 2 cubic yard bag. It's huge. It's more vermiculite than I will use in the next decade. And I got it for, I think, $17. So as opposed to the little tiny bag at the retail, if you can find a place that sells in bulk, you can, of course, you got to store a 2 yard bag of vermiculite. You can get it for a lot cheaper. So I've used a little bit of peat moss, not my favorite, but I've used vermiculite, but I've kind of just landed on the pine. You can buy them in a big bale. I store hundreds of dahlia tubers and I don't go through a whole bale.
Right. Appreciate it. Yeah, that's great advice. And thanks so much for coming on and reading the article and answering some follow-ups.
Happy to do it.
Well,
Maybe out there and plant some flowers this year.
Yeah, and if you're just hearing this on the podcast feed, please go out and pick up from next week the April, May, Mother Earth News, because these flowers are beautiful. Absolutely. And that's all for today. Thank you.
Right. Great. Thanks, Josh.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Mother Earth News and Friends. To listen to more podcasts and get connected on our social media, visit www.motherearthnews.com/podcast. You can also email us at podcast@ogdenpubs.com with any questions or suggestions. Our podcast production team includes Alyssa Warner and myself, Josh Wilder. Music for this episode is the song Hustle by Kevin MacLeod. The Mother Earth News and Friends podcast is a production of Ogden Publications.